Good evening from our headquarters in Kyiv. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I'm Natalia Humenyuk. Tonight on the Sunday show. Crimea, 4 years after the annexation, how Russia seized the peninsula. Crimean Tatar leader Akhtem Chiygoz, who spent 2.5 years in Russian prison, looks back at how it happened. Who's violating Western sanctions in Crimea? We take a closer look at how effective the sanctions are. In 2014, Ukraine was unprepared for war. Now it's a completely different situation. We find out about the Ukrainian military's transformation. 4 years after Euromaidan, historian Marcy Shore is telling the revolution's story in a new book. She explains why. In February 2015, Russian opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was assassinated. We report from the site of a memorial demonstration in his honor. It has been 4 years since Russia annexed Crimea. On the night of February 27, 2014, armed men seized the Supreme Court Council of Crimea. The little green man turned out to be from the Russian military, a fact later even confirmed by Russian President Vladimir Putin. That's how the Russian Federation's annexation of the Ukrainian part of the peninsula began. Crimeans have responded to the annexation in different ways. Some struggle to adjust. It's difficult to accept that you live in a concentration camp, one person said to me during my last trip to Crimea. Others have adapted better to living under Russia's occupation and openly talk about the differences between life in the two countries. And there are also those who celebrate the annexation. During this show, we will discuss political freedom and economic development in Crimea, violation of Western sanctions, and also how the situation had impacted Crimean youth. We have in our studio Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is herself an internally displaced person from Crimea. Iryna is the social psychologist and conflictologist. She works for the Integration and Development Center for Information and Research. Good evening. Before we kick the discussion, we'd like to show our interview with Akhtem Chiygoz, who is the deputy chair of the Majlis Assembly of the Crimean Tatar people. He was sentenced by Russia to 8 years in prison and spent 2.5 years behind the bars, but was freed last autumn after negotiations between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The Russian authorities accused Chiygoz of organizing mass disturbance outside the Crimean Supreme Council in February 2014, as Russia was annexing the peninsula. But the video you've just seen, there was evidence which demonstrated that Chiygoz was trying to calm the protesters. So Chiygoz's trial was marked by a number of serious violations, including the use of secret witnesses and the fact that Chiygoz was only allowed to appear in court via video link. Currently, he is in Kyiv. He recounts how Russia seized the Crimean Peninsula, the processes that led to its annexation, and his hopes for Crimean future.
We had this anxiety about Russia's increasing presence in Crimea for a long time, and during more and more active, groups such as Cossacks and all these politicians who have been speculating on the Russian world rhetoric but never had any actual connection to Russia. And these processes were quite frequent. Not long before that, in 2004, the same thing was happening. I remember all these worries mobilizing us as a national group, not as individual activists or civil societies. So without carrying out any specific preparations, we as a nation became capable of resisting this. That's why from November onward we started meeting up quite regularly, and this wasn't even subject for discussion. Or let's say the pessimists didn't discuss the need to support the Euro integration processes and the Euromaidan in Kyiv. Crimean Tatars would just flock together and take a train to Kyiv. And I did the same thing for many months. From November onward we represented the Majlis community at the Euromaidan. This showed us that in reality, the people living in Crimea have already moved on from the moods that were prevalent in the 1990s. Do you understand what I mean? First of all, the lawmakers from the Party of Regions did not provoke any feeling of respect. All of them were half-criminals, discredited within society, so they had no reason to think that they could be backed by the public. The public did not support them, bar some marginal groups. But what support did they have to work with? As strange as this might sound, the support from the law enforcement institutions, because law enforcement institutions were formed with a relationship with Russia in mind, the relationship with Russians, not pro-Ukrainians. These people did not consider Ukraine their state, their motherland.
At what point did it hit you that this is getting serious, that it won't end soon?
On February 27, 2014, before that, 2 weeks or maybe 10 days before that, I was returning from Kyiv. There was a big group of us and I told them one thing. After we were freed from prison, I was reminded of my words. I told them that a war was to follow. Now they ask me how did I know, but I didn't mean it in the sense of a war with Russia. I meant that there will be some sort of internal opposition that might escalate into an armed conflict, especially in Crimea. That's probably how it was going to be. And then Russia intervened. Then Russia sent its troops. We had no doubt that it was pro-Russian special forces that seized the local administration building. I'm telling you that a week before this, Sevastopol already carried out all organizational measures for its separation from Crimea. All of this couldn't happen without help from Russia's special forces.
How do you see Crimea as the occupation?
I think that there is no way of doing it using force. And recently I started to realize that there is no need for the use of force if we, as a state, along with our partners, continue to put pressure on Russia. Perhaps many people think that 3 or 4 years is a long time, but it will take some time for a monster like Putin to burn down. When I talked to the FSB people from Moscow who came to visit me, I realized that they aren't indifferent, which means that these measures that we're taking hit them in the right spots. The other point is that we need to increase this pressure and demand for Europe and the United States to do the same.
So we're joined by Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is the conflictologist, social psychologist, and herself is coming from Crimea. It's already 4 years, hard to speak. And when we travel, when we look, a lot of people would say the things remains the same somehow. Some of the situation is deteriorating if we speak about human rights violation. But really, what kind of impact, how we can describe the Crimeans, the Crimeans who come here, Crimeans who stayed at the occupied peninsula, and, their mood?
Well, I would say it's hard to imagine that things are same in terms of psychology, especially the social psychology, taking into account what kind of propaganda Russia puts on its population and now on the population of Crimea. What I mean, the whole policy block of influence, like youth policy, cultural policy, memory policy, educational policy now includes a lot of militarization that was not there, of course, during the independence time of Ukraine in Crimea. What we can follow, even in open resources, a lot of programs, a lot of activities, a lot of celebrations are addressed to show that the war is normal, that the war is romanticized, and that to be a Russian means to be military person. And that gets scary because, as we see, the youth is prepared to give the life just for nothing, and just decreasing the value of life itself for Crimean youth. Of course, it's scary.
And of course, I would remind, if you really travel to Crimea, especially on the days like the 9th of May, which is a Victory Day, or any kind of the celebration, you see the kids in the military uniform, you see the monuments of those little green men there. I would like our, how the people, you said it wasn't present, how it's influenced the, maybe, is it making people more scared? Are they usually, trying to hide what they think? How do you explain also this kind of a double speak that people are there? Because it's very hard to communicate to the people. They're trying to adjust it. So what is this psychology of adjustment?
Well, adjustment is a normal process for any humankind in this or that situation. Adjustment means that people try to look how to live their lives, how to feed their families, how to earn some money, how to, how to think about better future for their children. And adjustments means just a normal process. But For those who didn't celebrate this annexation, for those who stay Ukrainians in terms of civic nation of Ukraine, but too many reasons cannot leave Crimea and to move out, of course they are scary. Those who are in contact with us, with those who had to move out, they say we are waiting for Ukraine to come back. They're afraid to speak it out because since 9th of May 2014, to proclaim that Crimea is Ukraine means a criminal responsibility in terms of Russian legislation since 2014. So of course people hide a lot, but on the other hand, what we desperately need, I would say, is European or international scholars who would be able to enter Crimea and to understand more. For me as a social psychologist, it's clear that without being able to enter, I'm not able to enter Crimea, it means that I cannot research in a normal way what is going on there. So that for me it is the very important thing to ask international scholar community to, especially those who do research in social sciences, to put more attention and to go there and to see what is going on.
I would like also to bring the graph which is done by the number of the initiatives tracking the destinies of the political prisoners in Crimea. There are more than 60 people. Majority of them, they are in Crimea, but some of them, up to 20, are held in Russia, in Rostov, or even in Siberia, as Alexei and Alexander Kolchenko. We can see, you know, like it's very hard, in fact, for the human rights activists even to have these, you know, graphs, because you constantly need to update them. So it just given, you know, we can't even read every single name at the moment. We just know there are dozens of people, and you know, you can't even go to any personal story, but it also makes the people scared. You know, how you think this idea of this, you know, also the armed resistance or any kind of resistance is currently resembling the Crimean Tatars and Crimeans who stayed in that in the annexed peninsula, how their psychology and also is changing due to this constant threat of being searched, being, you know, arrested.
This is the policy of Russia to threaten any kind of resistance, not only in Crimea, but in the territory of Russia itself. To threaten any kind of another opinion, I would say, to be spoken out. We can follow it in many cases in a variety of regions of Russia. But in terms of Crimea, it means that especially Crimean Tatars, who maybe the most consolidated anti-Russian or anti-annexation part of the population, what Russia tries to do is not only to threaten by these cases and detainment, but also in not very evident way, like splitting Crimean Tatar population, rewriting national identity into religious one, in order to diminish any kind of claiming the national movement among Crimean Tatars that we have for 70 years non-violent.
I would like, you know, also in this map, you in fact see, or you can in fact to have the different graph. I will ask to show, and it also goes to the, you know, there are different kind of cases brought up again. So you see, you know, there are the cases of the so-called Ukrainian saboteurs. You see there are the waves of the rest. There was a famous case of the 26th of the February case. It's the day of the annexation, but also, you know, there are people who are banned to travel to Crimea. But what is also interesting, in particular, because the Crimean Tatars is a Muslim minority, and when we speak to the lawyers, human rights lawyers, they usually say that the practicing Muslim would be accused of terrorism. The political, those who used to cooperate with Mejlis, Crimean Tatar Assembly, would be kind of go to the extremist cases. So really, how do you think this, what are the, you know, knowing Crimea, you know, how are this idea of putting the Muslim, putting the Islam, and kind of putting the tag of the terrorism into that, how it generally might influence on the radicalization of the youth? And just general perception of the Crimean Tatars as radicals, which wasn't ever the case.
I would see it in more complicated way. First of all, when Russia entered Crimea in 2014, I would say that their views on what Islam is was based on North Caucasus issues and who are Crimean Tatars, what is the nation of Crimean Tatars, and what's the way of practicing Islam for Crimean Tatar is, they had no idea. So all the practices of dealing with the minority or dealing with something which is different from Moscow Orthodox Patriarchy was quite based on what Russia did in North Caucasus. Whereas Crimean Tatars are quite different way of, they have another way of practicing Islam, although there were a lot of different subgroups, which was okay in Ukraine, as Ukraine has probably the most liberal legislation towards different religious groups. So, first of all, I should say that Russian policy is different. Second of all, I would say that the Russian policy towards Islam in Crimea is to split again to the right believers who are under Moscow, including the Muftiyat, which seems very loyal to Russian authorities, and all the other Muslims that either forbidden in Russia, like Hizb Tahrir, or others that show those Crimean Tatars who practicing Islam but also show loyalty to Ukraine. So there are more backgrounds in this. As for radicalization, I am afraid it could take place in a couple of years ahead if Russia will continue such pressure on Crimean Tatars.
That's exactly how radicalization works. You can really create it from the constant threats where the people see that they are powerless, that they can't affect in any other way. But I would like also to go to the issue of the sanctions to show our story. So on paper, US and the EU sanctions on Russia prevent companies from doing business with the Crimean Peninsula. Airlines shouldn't fly there, ships shouldn't dock in Crimean ports, and credit cards shouldn't work there. However, in reality, many companies are covertly violating sanctions. And other claims that there are no control over where there are goods travel and where their services functions. So we look how effective sanctions are in occupied Crimea. There is a story by our colleague Natalia Vikhrov.
In 2014, the European Organization for the Safety of Air Navigation banned flights to the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula. But according to the Black Sea Institute of Strategic Studies and Maidan Foreign Affairs, who monitor illegal flights to occupied Crimea, more than half a dozen Russian airlines continue to fly to Crimea. In 2014, Dobrolyot, the subsidiary of Russian airline Aeroflot, was slapped with European sanctions, and as a result, the company's assets in the European Union were frozen, and its counterparties there annulled insurance agreements. They also halted leasing, repair, and maintenance agreements. In autumn of the same year, Russia created the new low-cost Pobeda airline. But after the saga with Dobrolyot, this subsidiary does not fly to Crimea. However, Aeroflot is among a number of airlines that continue to transport passengers between Russia and Crimea. It's worth noting that attempts by occupation authorities to open the international connection have failed. But aircrafts continue to fly to occupied Crimea, sometimes on the same day that they fly to the United States and the European Union. For example, on January 10, an Aeroflot aircraft flew from Sochi to Simferopol, later it returned to Sochi, then flew to Moscow, and from there flew to the Norwegian capital of Oslo. The Maidan Foreign Affairs estimates that these kinds of breaches have occurred more than 100 times in 2017 alone. According to Black Sea News, 23 aircrafts operated by 7 Russian airlines flew to occupied Crimea on February 22. At the end of last year, Aeroflot CEO Vitaly Savelyev said that for the first time in 4 years, he feels like sanctions could actually be imposed against the company, which is one of the 20 largest air carriers in the world. But so far, this remains just a risk.
So if you would like to explore the database of airplanes that flew to occupied Crimea and then to EU member states, the United States and the other destinations last year, it's available in English. Go to the webpage of the Black Sea Institute of Strategic Studies. You can find it on our Twitter and also on the comments of our Facebook Live. The Black Sea Institute of the Strategic Studies monitors flights and ships that violate the Ukrainian and international maritime sanctions against Russia-occupied Crimea. You know, the question would be, I recently talked to a couple of people who come from Crimea to Kiev, you know, while traveling. And there is this feeling that, you know, the West is taking it, for granted, the things that which had happened. You know, people would like to do the business as usual. These kind of things, like breaching the sanctions, I've felt very, you know, with huge disappointment by the people who stays. So really how this kind of feeling of inaction, feeling of not enough of pressure towards Russia by the West also could influence the society.
Well, first of all, I should say that I'm following the new wave of migration from Crimea to Ukraine, which is consisted of people who get tired to wait for something that should change the current status of Crimea being back to Ukraine or things like that. And it means that people who waited for 4 years there, that something will be changed with the help of European Union or NATO or US, that they need to continue their life somehow else. For the other people who stayed in Crimea, who continue to wait for some activities, unfortunately, it's probably a very sad reality that there's no actual way to do it fast. Since the beginning of the Second World War, there was no such a case when brutally a country would seize the territory of another country. So there is no mechanism, international mechanism, just sanctions, that would force in a legal way without taking violence or weapons out to force Russia to come back to the status quo that we have before the February of 2014.
If we would like to go back to the issue of the sanctions, because we also talked to Halya Coynash, a member of the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group. She is following the situation also with the human rights violations. So again, my colleague Natalie Vichro spoke to Halya Coynash about sanction violation, as well as the upcoming Russian presidential elections, which will take in a couple of weeks.
I think the most serious breach of sanctions has been Siemens, which has ignored warnings from everybody for 2 years and has been pretending for 2 years that it is in full compliance. And it's probably the most drastic of the occasions, because they have provided gas turbines to Crimea, which is very, very serious, because, I mean, Crimea depends on Ukraine, for mainland Ukraine, for energy naturally, and this breach of sanctions is a very serious one, and that one is really a case where they simply continued to say that they were in full compliance with sanctions, and they know nothing about any possible breach, even though they were theoretically providing gas turbines for a plant that wasn't being built. And they knew it wasn't being built. I mean, it was clear from 2016 that they were providing gas turbines for nowhere, unless they were indeed going to Crimea, and they just ignored it. That one is one where I hope the German prosecutor will get involved. At the moment, it's not clear. Other people are using more sort of clever ways around it. I mean, for example, Visa and MasterCard moved out of Crimea, indeed. They were following sanctions. And then Russia brought in a system whereby everybody has to be registered in Moscow. And now MasterCard and Visa are both claiming that they have nothing, that they have no control over the situation, that this is all about Russia having taken control over their transactions, and they cannot control whether somebody is actually making those transactions in Crimea or in Russia.
Whose responsibility is it to enforce these sanctions, and why aren't they doing so?
Well, this is the problem. I mean, the EU, when you ask them, will say that it's in the business of the individual country. The individual company will say that the country will then say that they seem to pass the I've forgotten what it's called, but you know, they pass the responsibility to somebody else. And nobody seems to be taking full responsibility for this.
We are less than a month away from the Russian elections, which will be illegally held in Crimea as well on March 18. We've heard from, the Kremlin installed Crimea head Sergei Aksyonov has already alleged that there could be a terrorist threat or possible provocations in the lead up. What can we expect from the authorities in the coming weeks in the lead up to the election?
Well, there's already been one person who's been arrested, a Ukrainian, who has joined the very large number of other, I mean, there are probably 66 already known political prisoners, people who have been arrested for reasons that really do not bear scrutiny. And the last one was just Davydenko, I think his name is, was arrested maybe a few weeks ago, and it was just after Aksyonov had talked about this supposed terrorist threat from Ukraine. I think, you know, they will probably try to invent some more terrorist threats, sabotage threats, and so forth. It's, you know, it's a good time to do it. It's a way of scaring the population and pushing the propaganda line.
Somehow the elections, the Crimea issue hadn't been really the issue for the Russian current presidential elections, in fact, compared to just one candidate, Ksenia Sobchak, somehow mentioned that she agreed that Crimea should be back into Ukraine, but after the referendum. So really, how do you see these elections and also the impact and the fact that people go to the polls there?
Well, Crimea is so big for Russian politics, has played its role 4 years ago. So it's no any kind of, you know, way to use it by Putin, let's say, again, because it has played its role totally. But what is important when Ksenia Sobchak speaking about let's make another referendum which will be more fair, it's not the case, because the population of Crimea, which we see there, which we can estimate, was replaced up to 20%. Up to 20% new inhabitants from Russia were moving to Crimea, and nobody would recognize such a referendum, even not taking into account that in Ukrainian legislation there is no such a point to have a referendum in Crimea. It was not in 2014. And as well in Russia, as I said before, it is a criminal responsibility to claim for such a referendum.
And I should add also, like, talking to different international events, like conferences, answering the question on the referendum prior to the annexation, on the opportunity to have it, what the sociologists usually used to say, that there was never more than 50% of the population ever supporting the joining the Russia. So there was no really any factual base or really to hold this referendum. But my last question would be also on the actions of the Ukrainian government. As to the social psychologists and conflictologists, you know, look, there is a blockade to some extent. There is also some kind of the, in the public debate, there are sometimes topics that, you know, those people in Crimea, they maybe wanted that. I see sometimes the disappointment of some of the Crimeans who moved here, who moved to Kiev, that it's not exactly an issue. So really how it influenced on the society, and you yourself, what do you think the Ukrainian state and the Ukrainian society could do differently?
I would say this is a question for another interview for about half an hour to answer. I myself, I've never relied on any government, and I've never relied on the state itself. I'm a person who rely on my own, and I didn't expect that state would do something. On the other hand, the processes in the Ukrainian politics since 2014, after the revolution of dignity, I would say didn't have enough resources to support people from Crimea. Probably it could be done more if we would be, I don't know, Norway in terms of resources, but Ukraine has a lot of other issues to solve as well. This is very good that we have human rights activists and groups who push the government to do something, but I'm not expect a lot.
Okay, thanks a lot for this talk. It was Iryna Brunova-Kalisetska, who is also herself had to move from Crimea.
Thank you.
And as well, for the full version of the interview, keep your eye on our website, en.hromadske.ua. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign-up box is on the upper right-hand side of the site. As well, follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International. We are there 24/7 for you. When war with Russia erupted in 2014, Ukraine found itself deeply unprepared. The military was simply not ready to fight separatist-backed and led by the larger and more powerful Russia army. In September 2014, Ukraine suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of Ilovaisk. In early 2015, it was again defeated at Debaltseve. Much has changed since then. Ukraine's armed forces have undergone an enormous transformation, but how efficient are they? So we speak with a defense expert, Keir Giles, to find out. That is an interview by my colleague Matthew Kupfer.
The change, of course, has been drastic and dramatic. The military is unrecognizable since the start of the war. It has transformed from the remnant of a post-Soviet army, underfunded, under-resourced, into an effective fighting force while, of course, fighting a war at the same time. It's been a dramatic transformation. Now, the problem with that is that some of the elements that might have been in place if it had been a more slow and methodical process of reform have not been realized in quite the same way as perhaps they should have been. This is the roots of some of the criticisms of reform so far, that it has not gone far enough in terms of westernizing the military according to some concepts like civilian control, transparency, and so on. Nevertheless, we shouldn't underestimate just how far the Ukrainian armed forces and all of their ancillary forces have come in a very short time.
So what would it mean in practice for Ukraine's army to reach Western standards? What would have to happen there?
Well, there are two distinct challenges here. The first is actually taking all of the best from Western experience and applying it. And that means in terms of command and control, flexibility, the jointness of operations between forces. But there is also an image problem that has to be addressed, and that is the fact that Ukraine is occasionally perceived as having armed forces which are inefficient because they are not under centralized control, and also served by a defense industry which is rife with corruption. There are immediate problems with that. If either of those are actually true, then obviously it hampers the fighting efficiency of the armed forces, but also in terms of the image that Russia projects to the West and the United States in particular, there are distinct disadvantages to this problem. For instance, in a very immediate sense, some U.S. aid is conditional on defense reform and on pushing through some of the changes that have been promised but not yet delivered. But overall, there's the enormous problem of convincing the United States and the West as a whole that Ukraine is actually worth defending and worth siding with. And corruption allegations in particular, when they are persistent and apparently unresolved, pose a significant challenge to that.
Two of the areas that are often mentioned in terms of problems in reforming the military are volunteer battalions and also defense procurement. Could you tell us a bit more about those issues?
Well, in the volunteer battalions issue in particular, there is a problem of perception lagging behind reality. The negative image of the volunteer battalions in the very early stages of the conflict, when they were an emergency measure to respond to Russian aggression, has persisted long after a lot of the problems that were associated with them, like the lack of direct control, the potential use as private armies, the independence from the armed forces effort as a whole. Those problems have largely passed and been resolved, but the negative impression has taken more time to dispel among critics of the Ukrainian war effort. And in defense procurement in particular, Ukроборонпром is portrayed as something which is impenetrable and not transparent, and actually a mechanism which is permissive for corruption. There are consistent allegations that defense procurement is based on not only enriching the people involved in it, but also providing to the armed forces those pieces of equipment which the industry is actually in a position to produce, as opposed to the ones that it actually needs. So another impediment to long-standing reform.
So you mentioned the image problem here. How can Ukrainian society, or for that matter, Ukraine's Western partners, how can they measure whether the military is moving in the right direction? What would the signs be for them?
Well, fortunately, the West does have a window into exactly what is happening in Ukrainian defense reform because, of course, all of the training missions that are actually working directly with the Ukrainian armed forces. That's sometimes seen as the West imparting knowledge to Ukraine, but of course it is a two-way process. It's a window into what is going on, and also the West learns about what is happening in terms of Russian military developments through that feedback loop being passed back through the Ukrainian armed forces. However, in other areas, and in particular, once again, defense procurement, there are criticisms that there is a lack of transparency, not only to those Western agencies that are seeking to cooperate with Ukraine, but also those that would like to assist it in terms of funding, but find that it's impossible to do so because there is a lack of visibility on exactly how funds would be used and how these agencies operate.
So given these issues, how can Ukraine's Western partners play a constructive role in this reform process going forward?
Well, we have seen just over the last few years a lot more conditionality starting to be attached to the assistance that is being given. Not in the direct military sense as far as we're aware. There doesn't seem to be any challenge to the ongoing training missions. But as I mentioned earlier, the United States, for example, has made part of its aid package dependent on some essential reforms being pushed through. I suspect that in the near to medium term, we will see more of those conditions being applied unless Ukraine does actually address its image problem and demonstrate that it is taking significant steps to resolve the defense procurement side in particular.
One final question. We've seen Ukraine has experienced some rather severe defeats in Ilovaisk in 2014 and Debaltseve in 2015. Is the Ukrainian army today efficient, generally speaking, or does it have a long way to go?
Well, let's place those defeats in context. This was at a very early stage of Ukraine responding to aggression and trying to work out exactly how it could optimize its armed forces in a crash program for resisting as best it could. We shouldn't see any performance of any military that is operating under those conditions as representative of what would happen once you can take a longer term and more considered approach to reforming it. In other words, we shouldn't judge the potential performance of the Ukrainian armed forces now by anything that happened even just a short time ago, like Ilovaisk and Debaltseve. So, as I mentioned at the very start, yes, enormous progress has been made in a very short time. There is still a way to go, but it's a very different armed force to the one we saw at the outbreak of the conflict.
Giles has contributed to a report titled Ukraine's Toughest Fight, the Challenge of Military Reform, published by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can find the link to it on our Twitter at Hromadske or in the comments to our Facebook Live broadcast. And I'll be back in a second. It has already been 3 years since February 27, 2015, when Russian opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was assassinated on the bridge not far from Moscow's Red Square. In 2017, 5 men were found guilty of the killing. Yet Nemtsov family and supporters believe that the official explanation of the democratic politician's murder is a cover-up. They alleged that the true organizer of Nemtsov killing is Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, whom the politician repeatedly criticized. Today, people across Russia are commemorating Nemtsov. Hromadske traveled to Moscow, and this is our report from the demonstration at the place he was shot, which many now call the Boris Nemtsov Bridge.
It was one of the most shocking murders in the history of modern Russia. On February 27, 2015, Russian opposition politician Boris Nemtsov was assassinated on a bridge not far from Moscow's Red Square. Today, people have gathered in Moscow to commemorate Nemtsov.
How could I not have come today? The government isn't even doing anything to find the killers.
It is people who care who gather today. People will be gathering one way or another.
This is our only opportunity to come together and express our disagreement one more time. It was a politically motivated murder.
Nemtsov's persona united all those who disagree with the Kremlin's policies. Today's demonstration was attended by representatives of right-wing movements as well as liberal opposition groups like the Yabloko political party.
They killed a state political figure. The responsibility is all Putin's.
There were some people who tried to provoke a clash in the beginning of the demonstration. Representatives of SCRB, or the Southeastern Radical Bloc, the same group that splashed green antiseptic in opposition leader Alexei Navalny's face last year. This time, however, things didn't get physical. The Russian opposition is demanding that a plaque be installed on both the house where Boris Nemtsov lived and the bridge where he was assassinated. Earlier, Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin endorsed opposition politician Ksenia Sobchak's idea for the plaque and promised that it would be installed on Nemtsov's house.
This is a leaflet that asks to install a plaque on Nemtsov's house and on the bridge where he was murdered. The more people who sign them, the greater the chances that we will be heard.
Demonstrators also shouted anti-war chants. Despite frigid temperatures of -14 degrees Celsius, several thousand people took part in the rally. According to the White Counter volunteer group, which specializes in counting people during protests and rallies and ensuring safety, there were 7.5 thousand people in attendance. The Russian Interior Ministry provided a much smaller estimate, 4.5 thousand. According to the OVD Info Human Rights Media Project, at least 3 people were detained today, but were released shortly thereafter.
There are a lot of reflections at tonight's Sunday show. So another one is about the Maidan. So award-winning, because that's what we're remembering these days here in Kiev. So award-winning historian Marcy Shore has just published a book, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution. In it, she recounts the story of Ukraine's Euromaidan protest and their revolution they created, the people involved and their hopes for their country's future. While the world saw Maidan as a geopolitical event, Shore viewed it as a moment when the most important decisions were made by the individuals. Hromadske spoke with Shore, that was me, a bit earlier, to learn more about modern revolutions, when initial excitement is followed by disappointment and demands for democracy often differ from demands for progressive values.
One of the things I try very hard to do in the book is to preserve that moment of the Maidan as it was experienced at the time, and kind of bracket or try to capture the experience of those people, bracketing the knowledge of what comes afterwards. The annexation of Crimea, and then the war in the East, the uncertainty in the East, the violence in the East, which has now become the war in the Donbass. And that war is a tragedy for many reasons. George Orwell says that that every revolution is a failure in its own way. And Tolstoy says that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, and every war is a tragedy in its own way. And among the many ways that the war in the Donbass is a tragedy is that, it didn't allow the whole society to kind of take hold of, and absorb and evaluate what the Maidan meant, because they were immediately thrown into, a situation of Ukraine having to defend itself, against an aggressive attack, through a combination of separatist and Russian forces, and the questions now that have come up that are so salient about national identity and, anti-colonialism, are very much, of course, influenced by the fact that this is a country that's under invasion.
Marcy, as a historian also, how do you explain that, the cause and the consequence? Because it happened the annexation of Crimea happened more or less right after. And then there was very, very fast consequence of the events followed by the war. And then when you today read a short summary of what happened, there was a Maidan and there was a war. And, the war, Maidan is described as the reason. So we can actually argue that, the war itself was a kind of a counter-revolution to the Maidan, and the part of the ideology of the Kremlin is in fact to prove that don't go to the streets, that would lead to the war, and will prove in any case that. And to some extent they succeed with that message. They definitely succeeded to throw it to the post-Soviet world, but maybe to some extent even to the international world, that there is this disappointment with the public gathering which can lead to the chaos. How as a historian you think we should treat and really explain that sequence in order not to lead to some tricky summary, tricky explanation?
Well, I think you're right that Putin decided to start that war. He instigated that war. There were local elements, and he found, local allies, and he found people who, either for mercenary reasons or for reasons of authentic inclination were willing to go along with it. But there would not have been a war if Putin hadn't instigated it. And in that sense, I think that was outside of the control of the people on the Maidan to control what Putin was doing. I mean, the point you make that, Putin said if you go out on the streets, it will lead to war, and then he starts a war, and so it proves, in retrospect, his claim. That's a kind of classic move. And Hannah Arendt has this wonderful, section in part 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism, and she talks about how, those creating totalitarian ideology always have the advantage of logical consistency, because what they are doing is forcing the world to conform, to the logic of their vision. So Putin says if you go on the streets, there will be a war. If you try to have a revolution, there will be a war. And then he starts a war, therefore making his prediction come true. In a sense, that's a kind of classic totalitarian move. He's creating the world to fit in with the worldview that he's proffering. Which Arendt says is always the advantage, that those propagators of ideology have, because they can force reality to conform to the ideas they set forth, through violent measures. I don't know how the Maidan or the people on it could have defended themselves against that. Certainly there was the element of the hybrid war. There was the element of post-truth. There was the element of disinformation. In the Donbass. And I know people like Serhiy Zhadan, were running around there, just trying to talk to people. That 6-minute video that he made during the so-called Russian Spring, in which he just stands there straightforwardly talking to the camera, and says we are not fascists. None of that is true. Come over to our side. I think is one of the most, poignant moments ever kind of captured on video of Serhiy, and he's not performing in any way. He's just speaking straightforwardly into the camera to his fellow people in Kharkiv, and said, and saying, don't be afraid of us. We're not extremists. We're not fascists. Please don't believe it. It's not true. It's not true. And, there were people like that who were trying very, very hard. But it turned out not to be enough. And I don't know what would have made it enough.
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. And also go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua. Since there are the full version of all our reports and interviews, including the interview with Marty Shore. They are always there. There is a lot more. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like receive Hromadske International weekly highlights. The sign up box is on the upper right hand side of the site. And follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Search Hromadske International. We are there 24/7. So thanks for watching again, and goodbye.